what I'm hoping to do is to point many persons of goodwill, be they journalists, researchers, investigative journalists, biographers, and so forth, in the direction of these inquiries, because I intend myself and urge you to spend the next 6 months of your lives, if that's vouchsafed to us, to stop the fascist Trump from becoming President of the United States. He is a Nazi and a fascist. In northern Italy, they have a wonderful term, Nazi fascist. That was the last phase under the German occupation of northern Italy. He fills the bill on that, as I'm going to try to show you. So I urge you to look inside yourself, find whatever qualities you have, throw them into the fray, throw them into the scales. So we're going to have fascism, Nazism, mental illness, terrorism, organized crime, and Trump, who has now received almost $3 billion in free television, and he's a psychopath. Now, this is all deadly serious. Now, I have to somehow lighten the mood lest it become overwhelming, but this is all deadly serious. We are dealing with a psychopath. One of the writers, you're going to get to know some of the main writers on narcissism and related mental disorders. One guy called Macoby has written Narcissistic Leaders. He's already in his second edition. He wants to remind us that psychopaths operate at the lowest level of moral reasoning with no concern for the common good. This is, I submit, Trump. They have no remorse or guilt for self-serving actions that harm other people. You look at Trump's labor history and related things. Psychopaths are unable to build lasting relationships, and in the business world, the failures of the, in this case, narcissistic type, they build empires of debt. And of course, real estate is prone to debt, and Trump, more than anybody, is prone to debt. The difference between God and Trump is that God does not believe that he is Trump. All right. Now, we know that Bob Woodward and his editor, Marty Barron of the Washington Post, with 20 writers, are doing a book on Trump. There are undoubtedly, basically every Democratic super PAC has some kind of a research team. Bernie does not have a super PAC, I guess, but he ought to have such a research team. So I hope you'll pay attention. There is one pro-Hillary super PAC that's going with $130 million. But as I'm going to try to show you, the types of attack that they have unleashed against Trump so far are totally inadequate. They are just woefully inadequate and will, I think, fail. You've also got other groups. We've got Bernstein, out of Woodward and Bernstein. We've got Bernstein running around saying that it's time to produce thoroughly researched documentaries about who Trump and other candidates are. I think that's a fine idea. And I'm offering these ideas, right? You may remember Dr. Justin Frank in 2004, How Time Flies. That was called Bush on the Couch, Inside the Mind of a President. Mind, of course, used advisedly. The finding was that he's a megalomaniac. Now, that's what we would need for Trump. Amazing that we don't have it. And of course, people don't want to do Trump because they're afraid, because he threatens to sue you. He threatens to bankrupt you, to destroy your petty resources, right? So a big fascist billionaire comes after just a little petty bourgeois here. Well, we have to fight no matter what. Now, who am I? What have I done? In 1988, I wrote the leaflet on the mental health of Dukakis that was distributed at the Atlanta Democratic National Convention, which seemed to have some influence on the 1988 election. I did this, not Lee Atwater. I had nothing to do with Lee Atwater, wouldn't know him. And then in 1992, George H.W. Bush, the unauthorized biography, I was able to put together an argument that Bush the elder he had a thyroid disorder, to be sure, but it was not Graves' disease. It was an altogether more serious malady called Basedoff's disease, and that this is leading then into what was called, remember, Operation Desert Storm. Underneath Desert Storm was a thyroid storm, in other words, a crisis of his diseased glandular endocrine system. Now, one of the big questions is, if you're going to spend $130 million, really, how do you classify Trump? What is the efficient way to make the American people understand what they're dealing with? He is, of course, a racist, and say so. He's a sexist and a misogynist. That too, by all means. He is a xenophobe. It's correct, but it's inadequate. You might also add that he's a nativist, a know-nothing, a white supremacist, an egomaniac, and so on down the line. This is fine, but it's still inadequate. You have got to call him a fascist and a Nazi. You know, people who take the more polite approach can go with fascist. The people who want to be more vehement or according to your mood, a Nazi. This alone is historically correct and effective. And it's necessary. I have to say, if you don't call him a fascist and a Nazi, you're lying to the American people. You cannot do this.
He doesn't care.
Yeah, other people do. I don't care what he cares. I'm talking about voters. I'm talking about stopping this guy with tens of millions and hundreds of millions, if possible, of votes. So, and this also implies a certain approach to social conventions. You cannot sit down in a kind of a salon-like atmosphere and have a discussion with a Nazi fascist about what Trump's latest outburst has been. In other words, a fascist, when you see them, they have to be ostracized. They have to be shunned. They have to be shamed. They have to be insulted. They have to be confronted with the moral depravity of what they're doing, and that this is unacceptable. It is profoundly anti-American. I have to make the point. This is the most anti-fascist country in the world, in spite of everything. We did this at lunch, right? Some people were there. We did a little quiz. You said, what's the most anti-fascist country? Russia? I'm sorry, Russia not. There was something called the Hitler-Stalin Pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that was a military alliance between the Soviet Union and Hitler. We never did this. We never became fascist ourselves, nor did we appease fascism, like Britain and France, and we never became fascist. You got to let me go, otherwise I won't get to the end. Write it down. I promise I'll stay as long as it takes. So be proud of your American tradition and fight Trump, because this is the anti-fascist country. And here we are out there. This is the Mayflower Hotel. This was the great foreign policy address by Trump a couple of weeks ago. Now look, Bernie, you've got to take responsibility for fighting Bernie. You have to expose Trump. If you leave this to Hillary, you see what Hillary comes up with? That he's a loose cannon. Oh my God, a loose cannon. This is pathetic. This is weak. You got to go with what I say. Nazi, fascist. Trump is a fascist. If you try to engage Trump on issues, that is a fool's errand, because he is on every side of every issue within the space of a week. You're going to look like an idiot. You're going to give him legitimacy, and he will win. And I don't want to see that. That could be civil war or World War III, because he's a psychopath, as I'm going to show. The Clinton strategy, she actually went on television and said, I'm not running against Trump. Well, of course you are. You're running against Trump. If you try to pretend to be above the fray, then you will lose. The guy is mentally unstable, erratic, and we've gone through it. Racist, nativist, this is fine. Morally unfit. And I don't want one of those stubby fingers reaching out to touch the nuclear button. There are some seats in the back, I think. So look, what are we talking about? Fascism, Nazism. Nazism means more or less the same thing, but applied with Teutonic rigor and relentless, implacable strength. It is a terrorist dictatorship. In other words, the policies are reactionary, but the means are terroristic. Gangs, beatings, goons, assassinations, stormtroopers, or storm-trumpers, as we say. Write that one down. That's important for the audience. Storm-trumpers. It is mediated through a violent, irrationalist mass movement of fanatics, right? The Trump voter, led by a charismatic demagogue mob orator with a personality cult. In other words, the issues come and go, The only thing that remains is the personality cult. Some of the issues are real. Yes, the free trade sellouts are real. Unemployment, despair, these are real. Hitler had real issues. Was the Treaty of Versailles unfair to Germany? Yes. Was the system of reparations unfair? Yes. But when you're looking for somebody who wants to have political power, you're not dealing with a catalog of issues. You're dealing with a will. There's a person there who's going to do things. And this is what you have to watch out for. It's also important, people have said to us, how many Jews has Trump killed? Well, in 1929, Hitler had not particularly killed any Jews at all. He did that later. So you've got to separate the early phase of fascism and Nazism, when it is contending for power, and that would be, say, Mussolini 1921, Hitler 1929 or 30, or Trump today. Compare those, and then compare the latter phases when it's already been consolidated into a totalitarian dictatorship. In other words, you want to compare the early Trump with the early Mussolini and the early Hitler. You can't compare Trump today to Hitler in the bunker at the end, right? It's apples. You got to compare apples to apples, not oranges. Remember also, in the past decade under George W. Bush, lots of people said he was a fascist. He was not. Because he didn't have a mass movement. He didn't have a violent mass movement of stormtroopers. Fascism comes on the scene under left cover. Mussolini was what? A socialist. He was such a socialist that Lenin had praised him. It comes with left cover, radical cover, anti-establishment cover. It is a hooligan movement of protest against the existing establishment. Most of the US descriptions lose this totally. So look, we're going to go through now, hold on to your seats. We have to go through a 10-point catalog of how Trump fulfills the fascist minimum. In other words, Trump has, of these 10 points, or 11 depending, Trump has enough of them, I think he's got all of them, frankly, to make a conclusive diagnosis on Trump. So I want you to have these, right? People go in the streets, and what do we have? As I say, the main point is political violence, beatings, gangs, militia, private security, Ku Klux Klan, Stormfront, white supremacists, savage, loving Cloven Bundy, the Lions Guard. Have you heard of that one? Trump has a personal militia, like the SS, called the Lions Guard. Bikers for Trump. So violence incited in public, a presidential candidate who incites violence at his own rallies from the podium in full view of the TV cameras. Squadristi and Sturmabteilungen. He does not recognize the US Constitution, right? There used to be these distinctions. Are you a constitutional party? Like in the Weimar Republic, right? Germany in the 20s, the communists were not constitutional, but the Social Democrats were. So with Trump, does he generally recognize the US Constitution? No. No. He wants to violate the General Welfare Clause of the preamble. And these amendments, the first, he wants to stifle, to strangle your right of free speech by increasing the power of the libel laws. Go to a British system. You know, the British system is, if I'm a little writer and I write something, Trump doesn't like it, I have to prove that it's true. Otherwise, I pay everything. His damages, his court costs, and everything. He can destroy me. He can reach over and squash me like an ant with the kind of stuff he wants to do. How about the Fifth Amendment? He says, illegals will not get due process. Hey, wait a minute. How do you know they're illegal if there's no due process? What are you going to do? Say, your color is not right? Right? Obviously so. So no due process for illegals means no Fifth Amendment. And the 14th, birthright citizenship, right? Think of the Union dead. All those people who died in the Civil War to get those amendments passed. And Trump wants to come along and get rid of it because he's decided to build a career on bigotry. All right, austerity. We heard it before. Excellent presentation. Wages are too high. No increase in the minimum wage. Is the minimum wage legal? He doubts it. Mussolini cut pay 65% before World War II. Hitler cut pay by 30% from the Depression lows to the eve of the war. Okay? So one thing about fascism is austerity. Fabulous rewards for the wealthy and for billionaires. The top federal income tax rate cut goes from almost 40% to 25%. My figure is minus 15% for the super rich. The estate tax is abolished. Hey, when Mussolini came to power in October 1922, the first thing the fascist government did was abolish the estate tax. Trump wants tax breaks for those who illegally stashed 2 trillion, or maybe it's 3 trillion, of profits overseas. So reward tax evaders, says Trump. They can't bring it back. We've got to help them bring it back. What does that mean, help them bring it back? Give them a tax break because they evaded US taxes. Union organizing becomes impossible. Every state will be a right-to-work state. Hey, I thought you guys were for states' rights. Not when it comes to union busting. There we have to have everything uniform. The personality cult of the charismatic leader. The man on horseback, the Caesarist, the strong man, ignores Congress. The triumph of the will. That's more than a movie by Hitler. That's Trump's solution to everything. If you say to Trump, how are you going to make the Mexicans build the wall? Essentially, is with the power of my personality, with my magnetism, and with the power of my will, we'll have the triumph of the will. Well, just don't go into the steppes of Central Asia with that, right? Because you're going to fare poorly. Notice also irrationalism. He says, I have a feeling, I have a feeling. Unchecked intuition, contempt for reason, mythology, legends. With the Nazis, it was think with your blood. Don't use your brain, use your blood. I have a feeling. So he's winning.
Before Wisconsin?
Huh?
What do you mean by before Wisconsin?
That's when he came out and said it. He said, I have a feeling I'm going to win Wisconsin, and he didn't. He lost it. Okay, let's start with scapegoating the weaker ethnic and religious groups. Jews then, Hispanics, Muslims now. Scapegoat them for the crimes of the financier oligarchs, of Wall Street, as we call them. And blame foreign nations for the crimes of Wall Street too. Notice also, there is no attack on Wall Street with Trump. The main target are what we would call bourgeois democratic politicians. They're stupid, corrupt, degenerate failures. He has contempt for elections, unless he wins them. Parliamentary procedure, no good, bad. Two second grade level of vocabulary and the rest. The bankers are spared. The fascist idea of revolution means the fascists take over the government, but not the banks and the corporations. So Trump is hitting on all cylinders. Then we have the demagogic promises to restore a mythical past greatness. Mussolini cited the Roman Empire. Hitler promised the glories of Charlemagne and of Bismarck to avenge the so-called November 1918 stab in the back. Now, the stab in the back was the German army was not defeated, but it was betrayed by politicians in Berlin. Jews, liberals, communists, whatever. In the case of Trump, he says, there were Muslims in New Jersey stabbing us in the back on 9/11. And these are both fantastic lies. Both Hitler and Mussolini promised to make their nations great again. They alternated with appeals to despair and pessimism. And there's also a cult of veterans, that some of the veterans are the most meritorious people in the society. Important, the hatred, contempt, degradation of women, misogyny. Trump is essentially a pimp. He's a pimp, and his brothels are called beauty contests. Miss America, Miss Universe. He's the owner and pimp of beauty contests, and he pimps out the contestants to his rich friends so that he will always be in demand. Say, oh, let's have a party. Call Sleazy Don. Don, bring over a couple of dozen of your beauty contest contestants. All right, so we of the Tax Wall Street Party have been doing our level best from Miami to Washington, D.C., to Washington, D.C. again. You can see some of the people here around the room. Here we are in San Francisco or Burlingame, the airport. Here we are in, I think that's Burlingame also, and that's Burlingame. So but we've done this in many, many places, getting the word out. Oh, how about this? The New York Times. It's 1927, and there's a Ku Klux Klan riot in Queens. Who's involved? Trump's father, arrested and hauled in to the station house. Notice there were also fascisti going on in the Bronx. Now, let me just double check. I think we've done all 10 aspects of fascism, and Trump has qualified. I hope you will agree on every one. I'll entertain objections. Now, in addition to these policy points or structural features of their movements, Mussolini and Hitler were megalomaniacs. They had delusions of grandeur. You have to know the sort of canonical succession of these megalomaniacs. The Emperor Nero was one. He seemed to be a perfectly fine young man until he got total state power, at which point he began killing all the people around him, including his mother, his teacher, and so on down the line. Napoleon is another. Hitler, of course, is another. And you notice they follow their intuition as long as it's working well. But at a certain point, it doesn't work well because it is untested and unverified and unvetted. So Mussolini and Hitler are megalomaniacs. How about Trump? What I'm going to try to do now, and I hope you'll stay with me, we have identified 10 mental disorders, 10 brain maladies, if you want, 10 examples of psychopathology that Trump exhibits. And I'm putting this out here because it's time for somebody like Dr. Justin Frank or somebody to come forward. My PhD is in history, so I'm on firm ground. I mean, I can tell you where megalomania leads when you've taken power. It was if you give a supreme ruler megalomania, then that's an explosive, very dangerous combination. But I'm also looking for psychologists, psychiatrists, psychoanalysts, and others, professionals in that field, so that they could add the force of their credentials to the kind of stuff that I can see, and thereby make a package that's going to have more effect. Now, in the course of this, we've come up against Jewish friends who say that this somehow, that Hitler and the Nazis have to be treated as unique, right, sui generis. And we would say, no, the history of National Socialism cannot be a taboo, despite all the deaths of the Holocaust. Nazism was, after all, not unique. And I say, having lived in Germany, no Germans, the entire world has a great deal to learn from the German tragedy of 1933 to 45, and indeed from Italy, 1922 to 43, because I've lived there too, and know the language and the people. When you say never again, it really ought to mean never again genocide, never again fascism. Or as we put it in the streets, no Trump, no KKK, no fascist USA. How about that one? Fascism is with us, and in America, with nuclear weapons, there is no greater catastrophe on the horizon than those stubby little fingers on the nuclear button. Now, here are some deadly fallacies. A lot of people believe this stuff and they died. They paid with their lives. So you pay attention because you can make something out of their sacrifice. Some people say, oh, he's just a demagogue. He doesn't mean it. Oh, it's so crazy. Imagine, we had in the previous speech, Mein Kampf, not only Mein Kampf, but Hitler actually had a second book, Das zweite Buch, zweites Buch. He wrote a second book. That's all he ever called it. He tells you pretty much what he's going to do. And people could have taken that seriously, but they don't. They're cynical, they're blasé, they think they know. I'm so sophisticated, I can't believe that Trump will really do those things. That's a terrible mistake. A lot of people died. Other people would say, we can control him through his advisors. This was the view of von Papen. Von Papen had been chancellor, one chancellor before Hitler. And von Papen thought he could control Hitler. Von Papen was lucky to get away with his life when Hitler sent a hit squad to kill him. And they killed his secretary, but von Papen got away and he became ambassador. He tried to get out of the country. There's this other guy, Hugenberg, Hugenberg is the head of Krupp, the biggest arms manufacturer perhaps in the world at that time. And he said, oh, we can use Hitler, we'll surround him with advisors, as von Papen thought, or we'll just influence him. We'll use Hitler as our tool. And this guy ended up practically with, he had a seat in the parliament, and that was all he had. Then another, the ultra-left version, the actress Susan Sarandon said, if Trump wins, then we'll really have the revolution. I'm sorry, I think that's a lot of baloney. You're not going to have any revolution. You haven't had it so far, and you won't have it when Trump is sending in his riot squads. Now, we also have our methodology, right? The basic idea is presidential candidates are not allowed to have secrets. They want control over the thermonuclear button. That means no secrets, no privacy. I don't care, your dog, your girlfriend, we want to know everything. Your money, we have the right to know, absolutely everything. The distinguished reporter Ron Costa of the Washington Post was on TV the other day saying, I don't get into Trump's psychology. Well, how can you do your job? That is a terrible mistake. That's incompetent. So he's been on all sides of every issue. If you stick to issues, that is impotent and futile. Another one. His public utterances, even though they don't mean anything much about policy, they can be used as evidence in evaluating his psychopathology. So once again, my appeal goes out. Experts in the fields of psychology, psychiatry, psychoanalysis, please come forward. Help us define Trump's psychopathology to allow voters to make a reasonable choice. Now, he's obviously a troubled psychopath, many symptoms of anxiety and stress, very short attention span, incoherent language, I think it's called aphasia in his case, unreliable judgment, posturing, erratic, policy shifts, flip-flops, outbursts of anger, incitement of violence, profane and obscene language. Quite a specimen, wouldn't you say? There is a behavior pattern. It's an impulsive decision based on basically nothing. This becomes a monomania. He's got to have it. Sacrifices a lot for the monomania and then drops it. This is Corey Lewandowski. Remember when Corey Lewandowski roughed up Michelle Fields, the reporter? And they said, Trump, why don't you just fire the guy? Oh, no, I can't do that. So he keeps him for 2 weeks. Then he hires Manafort. That's his new boy toy. And he gets rid of Lewandowski, and who's now on his way out. And this is infantilism. Now, we're going to have 10 of these hypotheses, okay? First one, Alzheimer's disease. If you go through 5 positions on abortion in 1 week, 3 positions on H1B1, HB1 visas, 3 in a day, and so forth, right? Is it that you're lying and you're conscious, or you just don't remember, right? I forgot. What was my position yesterday? I don't know. Look, the main thing is Trump's father died of Alzheimer's disease. Trump is actually older than he looks because unlike some of us, he's had the benefit of all that plastic surgery, right? That's why he's already orange, right? He's got everything working for him. Alzheimer's disease is often hereditary. The early onset kind is overwhelmingly hereditary. He may not qualify for that, but it's always got a hereditary genetic component. There is always a danger if your parent has had it. And these are the different types, the chromosomes, the APOE gene, and so forth. The early onset can start in 30s, 40s, and 50s. He may have been sliding towards this for a long time. I don't think that's the usual pattern, but it's possible. Now, the flip-flopping. 4 positions on abortion. First use of nuclear weapons all over the map. You're going to raise taxes on the rich or lower them? Because we had a good presentation, but he's gone up and down again. And then he says, I didn't mean lower it from where it is. I mean raise it from what I was going to do before. It was raise it from the place that I cut it to. So this obviously makes it all up. 3 different lines on H-1B visas. And his website all the time said he was against them. So what does that mean? This could be a sign of it, that he's not flip-flopping, but he has dementia. Now, he also seems to communicate with the spirit world. He says, how's Joe Paterno? We're going to bring that back, right? Well, the guy's dead, but then there's also the tribe of pedophiles that he left behind in the form of Sandusky. So when you say, how about that whole deal? It also means these monsters. Thank you. Hannity asks, which federal agencies will you shut down? Now, that's a dangerous question, right? Governor Perry couldn't remember. And he said, whoops, and that was the end of Governor Perry. In this case, he says, the Department of Environmental. Is that Queen's dialect? I don't know. I would know it if it were. But he's with this. He also thought that 9/11 had happened on 7/11. He got rid of he should have taken lessons from Giuliani, right? And here we have, this was a headline in one of the papers. He changed his line 3 times in one day. I've also heard that there's one where he changes his line 3 times within a 30-minute interview. So that can be getting bad for him. How about this one? The Washington Post editorial board. So they ask him, are you going to use nuclear weapons against ISIS, right? Destroy Raqqa? I don't want to start the process of nuclear. Remember the one thing that everybody has said, I'm a counterpuncher. Rubio hit me, Bush hit me. When I said low energy, he's a low energy individual. He hit me first. So yes, are you going to use nuclear weapons? He hit me first. I spent, by the way, he spent $18 million worth of negative ads on me. That's putting blah, blah, blah. So the Washington Post says, what about ISIS? You're supposed to be telling us, would you use a tactical nuclear weapon? And now this is a wonderful moment. I'll tell you one thing. This is a very good-looking group of people here. Could I just go around so I know who the hell I'm talking to? No. For the connoisseurs, you may remember the vice presidential debate of 1992 with Admiral James Stockdale, vice presidential candidate for Ross Perot. At a certain point in this thing, he said, where am I? Why am I here? And everybody said, well, of course, he's senile. Well, senility is the same as dementia. Oh, and thank you. Here we go. Dementia and senility. Look, according to the Alzheimer's Association, if 2 of the following are impaired, you should seek medical help right away. So memory, communication and language, ability to focus and pay attention, reasoning and judgment, and visual perception. I think Trump loses on all counts. He better go to a doctor. Also, difficulty remembering newly learned information, disorientation. Maybe you can't figure out the delegate assignment process going on in Colorado or something. Mood and behavioral changes. Deepening confusion about events, times, and places. I think this has been a staple from the beginning. Unfounded suspicions about family, friends, and professional caregivers. Serious memory loss. Behavioral changes. Is that what you want in the White House? I, for one, do not. Now, this to me says an elderly man trying hard to look less elderly who has Alzheimer's. And he's also got those, he seems to be putting out his stubby little fingers. Once again, make America great again. In other words, this is the ugly American. This is the enraged face of a degenerate ruling class. And he's not an alternative to them. He is them. But moving on, we can go to our second Trump hypothesis, the obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. Trump says this is what he has. Now, this is a very important moment. Trump says, I have borderline obsessive compulsive disorder. He has said this in public. I haven't quite found the quote, but I've found it in enough of the world press so that I think it's true. Now, that's a serious matter. It means that he has seen a psychiatrist. You know what we want? We want those records. No, we do. This is the important thing. This is what I accomplished for the American people in 1988, me alone, or me with some friends, was to make Dukakis reveal his mental health records. And now we should do this again, because with Trump, it's much worse. So he has been to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist has told him borderline OCD. We want those records. We want to know all details. And we also wonder, is that a limited hangout? Like if I have Alzheimer's, maybe I can't hide that I've got something wrong with me, but I could say, oh, it's just borderline OCD, right? You know how it is. Us billionaires, right? We'll see Howard Hughes in just a minute. 1% of young people, 1%, this is in Britain, 1% of US adults have it. It runs in families. Lots of celebrities talk about it. And of course, here we're going by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, which is the authoritative source. So he says he has borderline obsessive compulsive disorder. He's afraid of germs. He's obsessive. If you go up and say, "Hi, Don, how you doing?" It's like you have a joy buzzer, right? He will not shake hands. Now, he's learned how to do it. This is a little bit older, 2011. This was when he first came out with the Obama birth certificate stuff. He has this obsessive compulsive disorder. He will not shake hands, and especially if you're a teacher. Do we have any teachers? Well, Donald, your teacher, you're one of the dirtiest people, according to Trump. He says teachers have 17,000 germs per square inch on their desks. Now, this is already a lunatic statement, because if they're germs, there's certainly a lot more than that, wouldn't you think? I would. 17,000 germs per square inch. And he says, once he's in the building, he can't get out, because he doesn't want to touch the ground floor button. Because he says, that's the one they all touch. I can't touch it. He can go up to the top, but he can't go down. So this is, in other words, when you talk about escalation under LBJ, right? This is escalation that will not end. Okay, what about it? Orderliness, neatness, strictly delineated separation. In other words, you ever see the picture with the German professor and he puts the pencil down? It's got to be exactly perpendicular. Or the baby wants the corn to be separate from the peas at all costs. Can't mix them up. Closets. White clothes in one side of the closet, dark clothes in the other side of the closet. That's Trump. Counting. Everything's counting. And then he's got these other things which are kind of counting substitutes, like the famous BB Bong Bong. BB Bong Bong, he says, I gave him the money, and BB Bong Bong, I got the building permit that I needed. Obsessed by perceived snubs or insults. Endless pondering, rumination, and review. In other words, if you like an elephant, right? He'll never forget, or maybe he will forget once the Alzheimer's takes over. Now, Howard Hughes, remember him? Here's another billionaire. He had obsessive compulsive disorder, severe mood swings, the stuff with the order and the categories, the peas and the corn. He was obsessed with the size of peas and had a special fork to sort them by size. And you remember some of these kids, remember there were the plates that had the little raised divisions, so they'd be like in a third, right? So you can imagine the White House, the state dinner in the White House. It's got the plates brought out. Here's another one. Jane Russell was sort of the equivalent of Marilyn Monroe. She was like the brunette Marilyn Monroe. And he had a picture, and he said that it was a bunch of fabric bunched up along a seam that gave the appearances of 2 nipples on each breast. So he's obsessed with counting, right? How many nipples? And his diet was exclusively chicken, chocolate, and milk. Right? So white or black. And we have had some reports that Trump still has a very limited diet.
His butler had said that he only likes red meat and basically potatoes or white bread. He only likes red and white.
Now I think there may be some propaganda going on, because they try to say that he'll eat anything now, but I think that they're trying to bury that story. Now this is another one. He doesn't want to shake your hand, but if he does, then he's going to reach out and then grab you. And you can see this is Romney getting pulled in. It's called the pull in. You see? He grabs you over there. I don't know what he's doing. He's wiping the back of the other guy's hand on his shirt? I don't know what that is. There's something wrong with this guy. Now, here's the Daily Mail. I just put this up here. The world knows, huh? The world knows. The London Daily Mail. He says, shaking hands is one of the curses of American society. I have to thoroughly wash my hands, which I do as much as possible. The Oval Office doesn't want the G17. The teachers have 10 times the germ rate of other professions. So we want to see these reports. Trump hypothesis number 3, narcissism and megalomania. When he was in his secondary school out there in Jamaica Estates, he punched a teacher, gave him a black eye. He was then sent away to military school at New York Military Academy, grades 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, brutally beaten by coaches, okay? Hazed. This is like Eton and Harrow, right? Freud writes, narcissists, people of this type, impress others as being powerful personalities. A good hypothesis, full-blown narcissistic personality disorder. Grandiosity is practically his middle name. The need for admiration. The lack of empathy, right? Doesn't care about you, likes it better if you're suffering. That is Heinz Kohut. This is called the psychoanalysis of self. And of course, everything he does, the only constant, the only invariant is the personality cult. That everything, Trump has to be written. I mean, not even Stalin put his name on so many buildings, right? Stalin tended not to do that, at least in that form. I would recommend this study, Culture of Narcissism. Christopher Lasch died some years ago, but this is his book, In an Age of Diminishing Expectations. So the problem here is, if Trump is a full-blown narcissist, the danger then emerges of a kind of a resonance or a dialectical process of mutual stimulation between his followers. His followers admire Trump's ability to act out a narcissistic, sadistic fantasy on a grandiose scale and with impunity. Trump gets away with being a wild narcissist, and they see that as something they want, they identify. Is this a dialectic of resonance between the mental illness of the candidate and the latent mental problems of his supporters? And if that is the case, this looks very grim, because then we'd have essentially the parties would divide into the schizophrenic party, the paranoid party, the histrionic syndrome party. This is very, very grim. And see, with Alzheimer's, something like Alzheimer's, there's not going to be a whole lot of resonance about Alzheimer's. But with narcissism, there can be. In other words, you could have a powerful narcissistic movement. Maybe that's what we've seen to some degree with Hitler and the rest of them. Now, the idea here is with Lasch. This has always interested me. I've given talks about the inner directed personality and the other directed, right? The inner directed personality is the stern person with a gyroscope inside, right? I know where I'm going. My parents wound me up. I know my duty. I know my responsibility. The other directed is looking for signals. They've got antenna, and they want to see the shifting opinions of shifting peer groups. So the other directed is the modern or inferior one. In Freud's time, mental disorders were things like hysteria and obsession. They often involved greed for money or repressed sexuality. So in those days, we had the values of the superego, self-restraint. Today, rather, the diffuse character disorders, schizophrenia, pre-schizophrenia, and borderline disorders. So today, the society is infected with the values of the id, not the values of the superego, conscience, duty, but the id, gratification, impulses, self-indulgence. So what Lasch is saying, you remember, it starts with David Reisman about 1950, and the book is called The Lonely Crowd. So what Lasch is writing is that as we've gone from the inner directed to the other directed, the schlemiel, in other words, the conformist, the weakling, that we've also got this shift in the typical forms of psychopathology. And again, this narcissistic one scares me a lot because it looks like it could actually be this dialectic between the candidate and the base. Now, Father Trump, right? What kind of superego will our little Donald have, if he has any at all? His father tells him, be a killer, you're the king. Now, what kind of a superego is that, right? A superego could be serve your family, believe in God, and serve your country. That's not this. Be a killer, you're the king. So, poor little Donald got no attention. His father had no time for the kids. His only time for the kids is to take them with him when he works. So he says, hey, son, I'm going to go out and do an eviction. Why don't you come along? Right? Show you how to evict some people so they could watch him. The parents are distant. They are not teaching self-discipline. His father was in trouble for embezzlement and for racism, right? Discrimination in housing. So here we have a harsh and punitive superego which does not talk about morality, the moral law, your duty, your regard for your fellow man, the golden rule, the 10 commandments, the 2 commandments, none of that, but rather an exalted standard of fame and success. So in other words, go out there and be a winner, right? This is the main issue. Be a winner. And that's what we want you to do. We don't care how. The superego and the id will punish the ego with savage ferocity if you don't win. This is why he's so afraid of losing, of being inferior. This, I think, is a real insight that Lasch has. And most concerning when we get to the thermonuclear button, this is the kind of superego, again, the harsh, punitive superego. It doesn't say you have to follow these higher ideals. It says you have to crush the competition or otherwise you'll be a disgrace to the family. This superego derives its energy to some degree from the death instinct, right? At least what Freud identifies as the death instinct. In other words, the alliance of superego and thanatos, death. And I can see that stubby finger creeping across towards the nuclear button. Also, the loss of ability to sublimate instinctual drives. He's got to act these things out. He has no way to say, I'll be a great practitioner of something or other, right? He has to just do the art of the deal. In other words, greed. And I think this is important. Ponder it. Okay, now, to have hatred of women means to be afraid of women. This is quite obvious. Remember Melanie Klein? She was the first of the Freudians to do any analysis of children. And what she found was a rage against the mother. By the way, I guess we should have stressed perhaps more here, and I'm sorry. With this stuff, with the narcissistic business, the absentee father is the main issue. There's no father. There's no father at home because he's working. And then when you go to the military academy, you're an adolescent boy, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There's when you need a father. And there's no father. He's not there. So the absentee father. There is, with Trump, it's pretty obvious, there's a fear of actual physical impotence. And it's related to the racism. In other words, the male fear of physical impotence is connected to this fear that a played out Anglo-Saxon culture is about to fall before the advances of a hardier race. It was the hatred and fear of what? The Latinos, the Muslims, the Asians. They're more prolific. They have more sexual potency than you do. This is Trump. The narcissistic male has boundless rage against the female sex. So remember, hatred of women means fear of women. This is another important insight. Now, the Trump supporter has a lot of problems on the psychopathological side. Existence may seem futile and without purpose, emptiness and depression. Self-esteem obtained by attaching oneself to a strong and admired figure. There is no internal self-discipline for these people. They can't understand. Trump comes out and says, wages are too high. Are you going to vote for that? He says, I'm going to lower taxes on the rich and raise them on you. You're going to vote for that? It's like they don't register what has just happened in front of them. So they have a chaotic and impulse-ridden character. The rage against their own parents. This is often the case, right? The lack of happy memories of childhood can lead to a rage against the parents. And of course, promiscuous rather than repressed, right? All of these things, I think, from the narcissistic song bag apply to Trump. I would see Trump as the borderline of the frontier of neurosis and psychosis, with the grandiose conception, manipulation, ravenous for admiration and promiscuity, contemptuous of his own advisors. You know that scene in The Lonely Crowd, or the Lonesome Road, A Face in the Crowd, where the guy's going down in the elevator and he's just gotten on air and saying, y'all the dumbest bunch of suckers that I ever had, and I really hold you in contempt, and then he starts going down, and that's the end of his career. The contemptuousness of the admirers, I think, is important. Inner void, plus there is a pseudo-insight. In other words, he says, they tell me I should be more presidential, but I don't want to, and I'm perfectly aware of what's going on. Of course, he's really not. And terrified of aging and, above all, death. The emptier you are in life, the more comes the animal fear of death. Now remember, as Freud said before, the magnetic appeal of the narcissist. Another person's narcissism has a great attraction for those who have renounced part of their own. We envy the narcissist for maintaining that blissful state of mind, because the narcissist is totally focused on himself or herself. It's an unassailable libidinal position which we ourselves have abandoned, right? It's Trump. So, grandiose, lust for power, devaluing others, that's always important, right? Whatever it is, Trump has to be best. If you say, Trump, your wife is ugly, he's gonna respond. Trump, you're not as rich as you say. These are the points where you can get him. You can get his goat. You can get him going, and you can turn him into a geek act. You can make him go berserk. And I hope somebody does soon. No fixed values, restless and erratic. A traumatic childhood which has destroyed any real self-esteem, right? Because it's all bluster. Absentee father, always working. The best he could do was bring the kids along. Military school, beatings. The only values in the family are winning, winning, winning. Father embezzled money and the housing discrimination. In this Maccabee, which we had before, the gamesman, the new corporate leaders of 30 or 40 years ago, the narcissistic business executive seeks the exhilaration of gaining victories. And he argues the corporate culture promotes winning and being better. It destroys the idea of true cooperation and compassion. So once again, this is when Trump is coming on the scene. How about this one, Heinz Kohut? Narcissism comes from the lack of empathy by your own parents. By the way, with Trump's mother, I haven't been able to find out much at all about Trump's mother. There's just very little about her. She seems to be very much in the shadows, passive, hardly mentioned. We would hope to find out more. So, an irrational overestimation of the self or irrational feelings of inferiority relies on others to regulate self-esteem and a sense of value. Such people behave with outward sense of entitlement and superiority. They are dismissive of others. They have to be. They're disdainful and patronizing. Behind these attitudes are low self-esteem and feelings of inadequacy. And that's the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda talking. Okay, now here's another one. Hypothesis number 4. We're almost at the halfway mark. Manic depressive bipolar with borderline personality disorder, BPD. This is coming from CNN, 2011. So obviously it's the alternation of the manic phase and the depressive phase. It has severe mental depression, can be mania, or if it's not that bad, hypomania, not quite full-fledged mania. The problem with this is that there are cycles. Now, we have to appeal to everybody to help us. Can we observe these cycles in Trump? Let's see. Does Trump undergo manic depressive cycles? If so, at what intervals? Are there implications of the manic phase for example, if we get into a strategic or financial crisis? Has Trump had to disappear? Has he, for example, gone off the campaign trail at some point or other? And now we're up already to 5. Sadism, the sadistic personality disorder. Now the thing about the sadistic personality disorder, as I've been able to learn, is that it joins frequently with other kinds of pathology. Like you could easily have, histrionic or manic depressive and also have sadistic. So the comorbidity is very high. Donald Trump on The Apprentice. You're fired. Sadistic, right? Enjoying the suffering of others. Delights in tormenting the weak and defenseless. The poor Latino family, the mother with young children coming across the border. And it's obvious that Trump has to compensate for the sense of inner hurt and worthlessness that he has accumulated. Directed this against undocumented immigrants, but also, will there be a nuclear weapon used at Raqqa? Is he going to kill the families of the terrorists? If he does, he's probably setting off World War III. And he urges his own goons. He says, beat him up, punch him in the face. I'm nostalgic for the time when they would all go out on stretchers. The dark triad of sadism, psychopathy, and narcissism. Nope, we didn't eventually get that, but it's relevant. Hypothesis number 6, histrionic personality disorder with infantile regression. Now, histrionic, of course, this means acting, right? Being a thespian and getting on the stage. Strong dependency issues. They sexualize their relations prematurely and pull powerful figures into their orbit. They experience more indulgence and less frustration. They need to be the center of attention, persistent sensation seekers, and primitive regressions into fantasy in the service of the pleasure principle. Does it sound like Trump at all? I think. Huh? They need reassurance to maintain their stability. They complain that they are unloved or, and get this, treated unfairly. Trump's favorite expression, I've been treated unfairly. They've got to treat me fairly, the Republicans, right? Or the state conventions didn't treat him unfairly. And if you tell him no, it escalates into tantrums if anyone disagrees. Hey, number 7, multiple personality disorder by Trump. Trump is an imposter. 20 years ago, and there are tapes, he impersonated his own public relations spokesman as a non-existent person, John Miller. So he'd call up and say, hello, is that page 6 of the New York Post? This is John Miller. Trump is a great guy. Trump has 3 girlfriends. Trump is so rich. He'd never hurt anybody. It's not true that he's mean to Ivana. Stop publishing that stuff. Now, that's bad, but even worse is the fact that Trump today denies that it happened. He said, no, I didn't do that. You can hear the voice. It's Trump. He denies today that the voice on tape is his own. Sorry. His father did the same thing. When his father wanted to do dirty deals, he did it under the pseudonym of Mr. Green. Mr. Green was Fred Trump. Now, this one was suggested. I think it's quite relevant. Hypothesis number 8 is mad cow disease, caused by Trump steaks. He apparently eats 3 low-grade Trump steaks per day. Have they been tainted with bovine spongiform encephalopathy? or otherwise known as the Creutzfeldt-Jakob syndrome or Creutzfeldt-Jakob syndrome, rapidly progressing dementia, memory loss, personality changes, hallucinations, anxiety, depression, paranoia, and so forth, jerky movements, balance and coordination dysfunctions, and so on. You know, that's as good as any. If you're going to really eat 3 steaks a day for your whole life, and it's this lousy quality, I think that's to be taken quite seriously. How about this one? Alcoholic codependence. His brother died of alcoholism, his elder brother, Fred Jr. So we have the dysfunctional Trump family who enabled, now you say enabled, how enabled? This is the language of the critical literature in this field, which I have surveyed. The Trump family enabled the alcoholism of elder brother Fred J. Trump Jr. And here's the quote: "The alcoholic is said to suffer from the disease of addiction, whereas the family members suffer from the disease of codependence." Okay? So there's a psychological impact on him from the fact that the brother is an alcoholic. And finally, hypothesis number 10. You remember he was 4F in the draft, did not go to Vietnam. And he says, the 70s and 80s were my own personal Vietnam. And he was not dodging the machine gun bullets of the Viet Cong. He was dodging venereal disease, STDs, and HIV in his life as a playboy in Manhattan. So what we're looking at here is long-term syphilis, which can produce some of the symptoms exhibited by Trump. In other words, dementia. And you might say, look, somebody that rich, somebody that famous, right? You're telling me he didn't get a thorough checkup to find out what was wrong with him? I would just remind you that President Ronald Reagan spent 1 whole term in the White House with no colonoscopy until 1985. So it was only after Reagan had been in power for 4 years that it was discovered that he had some kind of a cancerous lesion in his bowels. Now, those are the 10. I think those are all to be taken seriously. Some of them more so than others, but I think every one of them deserves an answer because you're talking about the future of all of us. You're talking about the thermonuclear button, for God's sake. So what does he have? The problems he has now would get worse in the White House. In other words, you give somebody power, whatever problems were there are going to be magnified. And again, the example of Roman Emperor Nero, it seems to me, is a good example. He was a fine young man until somebody gave him absolute power. So, delusions of grandeur, degeneration into paranoid schizophrenia, a downward moral spiral of crimes and atrocities, the impact of defeats, public snubs, unavoidable. Nero, Napoleon, Hitler, George W. Bush. Trump Tower becomes the bunker. Mar-a-Lago becomes Berchtesgaden, right, the retreat in the Bavarian Alps. Now, paranoid schizophrenia. Grandiose delusions are found in paranoid schizophrenia, in which a person has an extremely exaggerated sense of his or her significance, personality, knowledge, or authority. Well, when you get into the White House and they start kowtowing, then that makes this stuff worse. Now, we don't need to go into this too much, but there are dirty money and mafia charges involving the Russian oligarch Felix Sater. Maybe the easiest way to summarize this is, in the last phase of the election, Senator Cruz was pointing out that the reason that Trump does not want to reveal his tax return is because these tax returns would show his connections to the mafia of the United States and the Russian mafia, the Russian oligarchs, and so forth. There are a couple of other names that come up with that. But his friend Sater has 2 felony convictions, and there you see what Cruz had to say about it. If you want to pursue this, Daniel Hopsicker, some of you may remember him from 9/11 Truth. He's got the Mad Cow Morning News, and he's done some articles about Trump and the mob. Oh, sorry, on the obsessive compulsive. In the public schools of northern Queens, it used to be step on a crack and you'll break your mother's back. That's an adult to believe that would be that kind of syndrome. Now, Graydon Carter, Vanity Fair, then of Spy magazine, he wrote, "Like so many bullies, Trump has skin of gossamer. Just to drive him crazy in 1988, I took to referring to him as a short-fingered vulgarian in the pages of Spy magazine." And he says that as of November 2015, he continues to receive pictures from Trump of Trump's hands circling to show how big his hands and how long his fingers are. And there we see the version from the New Yorker. So the Tax Wall Street Party proposes to hold an international conference in September with the title Investigating and Classifying the Psychopathology of Donald J. Trump. The other thing you can do, of course, is realize, once again, that some of his issues are real. He never talks about Wall Street guilt. Mussolini talked about the stab in the back. Mussolini, the mutilated victory. Trump talks about free trade sellouts and runaway shop. Fine. We can fix that. 15% protective tariff, $15 minimum wage, repeal the Taft-Hartley Act, go back to the Wagner Act, seize the Fed, $6.5 trillion for credit, 40 million new productive jobs. Ultimately, that's how you wipe out the potential for such a demagogue. Now, life under Trump, a reign of terror. It all comes from Nixon, strangely enough. The people around him are all Nixonia, lots of them. Roger Stone has a tattoo of Nixon on his back. Manafort the thug is from the Nixon White House. They will use the Patriot Act. They will use NSA surveillance. They will use FBI provocateurs and COINTELPRO in ways that nobody has dreamed of. And they will use libel suits to prevent anybody from reporting on these things. The October surprise. How can Trump hope to win the presidency? Well, based on the polls, he cannot. He cannot be elected. Therefore, a terrorist event, something like San Bernardino, or better yet Paris, or maybe Brussels in September, October, it's obvious, to stampede voters into supporting Trump and to seem to give credibility to his specious arguments. There are clearly pro-Trump intelligence factions. In other words, what you're seeing is Wall Street dumps the Republican Party, Wall Street supports Trump, and if Wall Street makes that shift, the corresponding intelligence factions, CIA and so forth, will come along. This has been discussed by Bill Maher, Frank Luntz, Republican pollster, Tom Friedman of the New York Times on Meet the Press, WNYC Brian Lehrer, One Morning with Mark Green, and Charlie Rose with a woman who's the correspondent for the New York Times. So this is what's being talked about. October surprise, September surprise for Trump. The rage of the wounded narcissist knows no bounds. Narcissistic rage is uncontrollable, and unexpected anger resulting from narcissistic injury that threatens the narcissist's self-esteem. So some foreign leader, suppose Kim Jong-un says, "You're a jerk." Is that going to lead to World War III? Well, with an infantile specimen of this kind, it can. And here you are on your journey with Trump glaring in the window. Now, in a certain sense, Trump is not likely to be president. During the last phase of Watergate, we had Kissinger, Haig, and Schlesinger said among themselves, if Nixon tries to nuke some country, we won't do it. If he wants to get out of Watergate with a nuclear war, we won't go along. Notice also General Hayden's warning that the armed forces will not violate the Geneva Convention by obeying illegal orders from Trump. I hope not. But you can see it's better not to get into this territory, because by the time you get into this territory, there are no good answers. Right? The only thing to do is to get out of it. And I invite you, every one of you, join us. We're the Tax Wall Street Party. My name is Webster Tarpley. Tarpley.net. There's a message box on there. You can find it. Send me an email. Join us in a 6-month mobilization to stop Donald J. Trump from becoming President of the United States. We wish to preserve our institutions, and secure a successful party realignment into some kind of a decent future for all of us. So thank you so much for your kind attention. 7:10. I guess we got about 10 minutes if anybody's, if anyone is interested, please go ahead with your questions. Yes?
It's a very minor point. What's so bad about the libel thing, since the British have that provision in their libel laws? What's so bad about it?
Well, the British system is an abomination. In other words, you can't write about anything serious.
I know that.
I have been offered to publish British editions of my books, and I've always said, no, I don't want any part of it.
But it's not
The-
born out of fascism.
Huh?
It's not born out of fascism.
Well, it's bad enough. It's born out of oligarchy in the following sense. Under the British system, you know, in the British system, you as the writer have to prove every detail of what you've said, which simply means that if I write, you know, Tony Blair was complicit in 9/11, he can haul me into court and make me a pauper. I can go end up living under a bridge because I can't prove it in that sense, right? I'm talking political analysis. And, you know, Tony Blair probably implicated, right, in 9/11, a bunch of other things. Under our system, you have to prove actual malice. In other words, the relevant case is New York Times versus Sullivan. And under New York Times versus Sullivan, the enemy, right, the target of whatever I'm writing, that guy has to, like Trump. Trump would have to prove that I knew it was false when I wrote it, or I acted in reckless disregard of whether it was true or not. Now that's much, much harder, very difficult for Trump to prove that against me. But if Trump can sue me in a British court, he can say, Tarpley, prove everything that you've just said. And this, of course, is an impossible task because of the very nature of the analysis. So the British system is totally oligarchical. It's designed to protect powerful people from essentially the obvious criticism, and it chills and restricts public debate to an extraordinary degree. And you've seen things like any number of times in recent years, you have scandals going on in Britain. They can't be commented on in Britain because of the libel laws or the Official Secrets Act, almost as bad. And they all follow it through the U.S. press because here you can print what you want. So I think it's an example. A lot of times under the influence of Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky and people like this, everybody concludes that the U.S. is the worst of the worst in all areas. It's not true. And here the First Amendment is a great shield. And what I urge people to do is test the limits of the First Amendment all the time. The First Amendment lives through us, writers, thinkers, intellectuals, right, protesters. We've got to keep the First Amendment going because otherwise somebody like Trump will come along and lay this libel law stuff down. So if there's no other issue involved, fighting him on the libel laws I think is worth it. Yes?
Considering the history of these kinds of personalities in the world, have you personally considered what you might do if he gets elected in terms of like leaving the country and protecting your family?
Yes.
Just give us an idea so we don't become paranoid.
No, I think what you need to do now is to realize that if you compare the United States today to Germany in 1933, our institutions are incredibly stronger. In other words, the Constitution has a tremendous mass base. People believe in constitutional liberties, and they realize that this is a great...
That's not a delusional thing that he could be stopped.
I think he can be
His
stopped.
advisors could do it. That's a delusion. What you're saying, the system that we have in government can stop this kind of a person?
If with a mass mobilization. Remember, another good point about the U.S. is this is the land of the mass movements. We've had them. We've had abolitionism. We've had the populists. We've had the progressives, whatever they were, but we've still had them. We had labor in the 1930s. We had civil rights going on for 20 years. We had the student movement. We had the anti-war movement above all. So this is the land of the mass movements. And what we obviously need is, what I see is a revulsion against Trump. In other words, a regurgitation. Spit this out. Get rid of it. The press, obviously, 3 billion of free publicity. It seems to me there is a fighting perspective to stop him. I'm not exactly sure how.
Once he has the power, you think mass movements can get him out?
Yes, I think that.
Even with a staff of Giuliani, Christie, and others?
Yeah, because these are plug uglies. These are not charismatic people at all. So it seems to me, my call right now is not to plan to go to Canada or some other places. It's too boring. They don't have mass movements like we do. We have them, and we need another one soon. So I invite everybody, don't run to Canada or someplace else, unless you've got some setup that makes it very easy for you to do that. Stay here and fight this guy, because it's a culturally alien thing. I'm trying to say fascism did not pass, and there's no reason why it should. Yes?
I just want to say, what's alarming, however, is that Trump has consistently garnered many votes in every primary.
In Republican primaries, which are madhouses, right? Loony bins.
But also, his supporters they're an example, I think, of many of them, if not most of them, of that phenomenon of people who vote against their own interests, okay, and don't. Well, I think it's alarming. I think it's a dangerous situation as far as I know what I was going to say. And it's rooted in the supporters, these supporters who vote for him. It is rooted in racism. It is the way working people who are afraid of the day coming when the Caucasians are going to be a minority. They're afraid of that. That's a real thing. White people being afraid, we're going to be a minority. And also, when that whole let's make America great again, and also these immigrants come in, not even just that take our jobs, but they're on the dole. They're on the,
Right.
My parents or grandparents or whoever came in, and it's that whole routine. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, maybe we just address a couple of these, because these are very important points that you bring up. The first thing is,
immigrants come in and want handouts.
yeah, handouts. Look, you look at the main countries in the world today, the common denominator is they all have a demographic crisis of not enough people. Europe has a demographic crisis. There's no reproduction going on. In other words, the populations are falling. Japan is perhaps even more extreme, that the population is aging. China, because of the crazy one child per family policy, which they got from some crackpot environmentalists here in the United States, they've got a terrible situation. Russia, similarly. So you look around, all the big countries have a problem of demographics, not enough people. The opposite of the population bomb or any of that stuff. There is no overpopulation, there's underpopulation. Now, the United States, happy are we that people around the world still want to come here. If you ask me what do I think is the main strategic advantage of the United States in today's world, it's that people want to come here. We are the classic immigration country, right? As they say in Europe, das klassische Einwanderungsland is us. People want to come here. They want to work. Look, the problem of assimilation is simply a problem of the labor market. All you need is readily available jobs, and people will assimilate fast, right? I believe in the melting pot. I think that everybody brings what they have to give, and then the outcome of that is a change of the melting pot, to be sure, but it's constantly producing a new sort of national spirit or other factors. This is our tremendous advantage. I would not interfere with this in a million years, because it's also the case that at least as a tendency, we know how to solve these problems. You go to some place like France, they do not know. They've been laughing at the racist US for all these years, but it turns out then when you have the Algerians in the banlieue, they don't know what to do. So I regard immigrants as human capital to be educated, to be developed. You've got to invest in that. That's your future. If we didn't have them, we'd be looking at a demographic collapse on the scale of some other country. Now, in the United States, is there really an ethno-cultural identity? I mean, look around this room. There is no such thing, right? There is a melting pot, but there's nothing that says, you know, you have to be from this place or that place or anything else. I don't see that at all. You want to take the opposite one. I think probably the most different is perhaps someplace like Japan. This is just my guess, that in Japan the ethnic and cultural uniformity is pronounced, right? So we're at the opposite end of that. But I think, and New York City especially, right? New York City is essentially a machine for assimilating generation after generation of immigrants, right? The layers of, you know, ethnicity, from, you know, Polish, Irish, Italian to Far East or whatever else you have, Russian, all different ones. I think that's a tremendous strength. I think that the hybrids are stronger, and the U.S. should regard this as a tremendous advantage. Therefore, I think that these people, when they make yeah, I know, they're crazy because they know nothing of economics. All they know is their idiotic story. And again, I'm happy to reach out to them on issues. But in terms of that mindset that they hate foreigners, and xenophobia is a suicidal impulse in today's world.
Trump has not said that immigrants are going on the dole.
Well, I think this is strongly implied.
No, but I know, there's a danger of putting words into his mouth which he has not used.
Wait a minute. There are plenty. He has a media cartel. The media cartel is led by Matt Drudge of the Drudge Report. Here then we find Michael Savage, a fascist, from Jamaica. Did we go through that in this one, or was it the previous one? Michael Savage. We have Breitbart. I think Alex Jones has unfortunately joined this.
Mike Rivera.
Huh?
What's with Mike Rivera?
I don't know. I've stopped following him. I think he's too obscure. But anyway, there are all these people, and they make clear what perhaps Trump, you know, he says it through his surrogates and through his various stand-ins, right? So I think there's little doubt that Trump is strongly saying that you've got foreigners who are taking the benefits that your children should be taking. Yeah, I am not in favor of the existing distribution. It's unjust, right? It was established by Reagan. It's redistribution from the lower and middle to the top 1%. This has to be stopped. But still, no matter what you do to have an economy, you're going to need large numbers of immigrants. So why not legalize it? Why not make this essentially the opposite of what Trump wants? Instead, it was not a wall at all, but a process of rather easy immigration. I think that would be the future. Yes?
I'm just wondering, do you consider Trump a genuine member of the international elite, or more of
I would say, yeah, I think he is. And you could say, well, isn't he really vulgar and stupid and barbaric and savage? And, you know, isn't he, I don't know, a rapist? Who knows what? Yeah, I think he's all that. But again, look at the other ones in that same group, and you'll see that he's not so different from most of them. He's probably more bombastic. In other words, the narcissistic, histrionic, or other parts shows up a whole lot.